So I'll jump into a presentation to talk a bit about climate finance and what that means for you as people and for us as citizens in Canada for policy. Before I jump into that, I want to say thanks to everyone for your interest in this subject. Thanks for your work as parents, grandparents, people in our community for fighting for climate action in all of these different ways, and for your interest in learning more about this particular way, climate finance, as an opportunity to drive climate action further in Canada. So I really want to leave space for a discussion, because I find everyone comes to this topic about climate finance, finance policy, climate policy from a different starting point. So I have a presentation and we'll run through that. But I'm most excited for a point of conversation, dialogue, and any questions that you folks have about this subject and how you want to learn more and engage. So keep that in mind and keep those on stack. Great, can you all see my screen? I'll jump into the presentation. So I'll be talking about climate-aligned finance and policy. As Gabrielle mentioned, I am Senior Manager of Climate Finance at Environmental Defense. For those who don't know, Environmental Defense is a leading policy advocacy organization. We work on climate issues, environmental issues in general, like plastics, toxics, and I lead our climate finance work, trying to get the financial sector, so your bank, your pension plan, to align with a safe climate. We are going to talk about, first of all, what does climate even have to do with finance? Most of you registered or participating in this webinar, so you're clearly understanding that there's a link between climate and finance, but let's start with that from scratch. Then what does climate finance actually have to do with people, with us as residents of Canada, as people who have bank accounts, pension funds? What does climate finance have to do with policy? Why does engaging with government make sense? Maybe over and above engaging with your bank or institution. And then really productively, what can you do? How do you take this information into action? Let's start off with what climate change has to do with finance. The climate crisis is urgent. It's upon us. The majority of pollution that has caused climate change is caused by fossil fuels. About 80% of the pollution that causes climate change is from oil, gas, and coal, the burning of those fossil fuels. We've already locked in at over 1 degree of warming. We're feeling the effects of climate change in some ways that people say, are nice, like a 20-degree April in Toronto, but other ways that are very obviously dangerous, like floods across BC and wildfires out east and out west in Canada. Of course, global crises where many countries who contributed the least to global emissions are bearing the worst of the crises. So all of that to say that we have about 5 to 10 years to really turn things in the other direction, to cut emissions in half by 2030 and get us back on a right track where we have a livable planet. Damages from the climate crisis are already being felt in many areas of our lives. Action is urgent. And if you think about all of that, again, what's the role of finance here? What's the role of specifically private finance, banks and pension plans and insurers? Investments shape the economy, right? So, your pension plan invests in infrastructure. That infrastructure is built and helps contribute to the way things operate. And, your bank invests in mortgages, which means people have homes and are building houses around you. So all of those investments are actually shaping our economy. It can seem super obscure, but it's very practical. And the dollars that we're putting into the bank and our pension funds end up shaping the world that we live in. So the real question here is what are we building? First I'm just focusing on the impacts on climate change from finance. How are these investments helping or hindering climate action? Where we're at now, the financial system is making climate change worse the financial system is still bad for people and planet and is not delivering positive impacts for us on the ground. The largest banks globally have invested $5.5 trillion into oil, gas, and coal since the Paris Agreement. So in the past, 7 years, at a time when it's been very clear that we need to shift the trajectory of how our economy works. Financial institutions have not yet done that. With all of this financing into fossil fuels, it's very clear that current financial practices are holding us back globally from meeting our climate targets, and certainly in Canada. Canada is one of the only wealthy G7 nations whose emissions continue to grow. That's very concerning. That's the wrong trajectory, and we're still an outlier. Canada's financial system is a big reason why Canada is not yet meeting our climate targets and cutting down those emissions. So we have to fix this. Finance has an impact on climate change, and right now it's a bad impact. And now I'm kind of looking at the reverse here. We talked about how finance affects climate change, can make it worse. Now let's look at how climate change, next slide, how climate change affects finance and the risks of climate change to finance. Because we have to think about this, of course, in the global sense, but also, we're all here. We want to pay our bills. We want to get our pensions at different points in our lives and have our money secure so that we can, exist in this world and pay our rent and maybe, get by. So we need to make sure that our financial system is stable, that we have confidence in it working. Over $100 billion of assets in Canada are at risk of becoming obsolete as we transition to climate change. So investments in fossil fuels where people won't be using those fossil fuels anymore and the business case will go down. And here I put, a bit of a detailed policy focus quote, but it's super useful because the main financial regulator in Canada, so the branch of the government that oversees and tries to make sure the financial system is working okay, said outright that later action on climate policy means bigger risks to our financial system. So financial stability is at risk as climate change worsens. That's probably obvious to most ears in this crowd, right? Like the atmosphere, biosphere is collapsing. Yeah, the stock market's going to go down. Our money will be less secure. But it's taken a lot of years and a lot of different ways of saying that to get the economists, the financiers to understand that. And the bottom line is we're still at risk. So we're at risk in two ways, really, with finance worsening the climate crisis, and then a more drastic climate crisis also putting our economy at risk. Now let's hone that into Canada. I talked about global fossil fuel financing, some of the risks overall. Specifically at home, as Gabrielle mentioned, Canada's big banks are all among the top 20 financiers. RBC, Royal Bank of Canada, Canada's largest bank, was named the #1 biggest fossil fuel financier in 2022, providing at least $42 billion. Canadian banks provided about $1 trillion of that overall $5.5 trillion in the past 5 years. So that's about 15% of global fossil fuel financing has come from Canadian banks. And we're not the world's biggest population, right? So if you look at that on kind of a per capita basis, we're punching above our weight in a really, really bad way. So Canadian financing of oil, gas, and coal is putting global climate targets at risk, is putting global climate stability at risk. That focus was on the bank, looking at Canadian pensions. Many of them have made commitments to cut emissions from their investments, so, to reduce their negative climate footprint, but they aren't necessarily taking the actions. They're still investing in a lot of problematic areas. And importantly, almost none of them have Indigenous rights policies to accompany the way they're investing. And we know that's of course incredibly related to poor climate policy and poor environmental policy. And again, all of this is in a framework where Canada, or in a world where Canada's the only G7 country where emissions keep increasing. And historically, we're one of the largest global emitters. So if you look at our emissions, all the way all the way back in history. We're one of the top 10 countries for how much we've polluted. So we need to do more to fix our climate pathway. And finance is a really important area to do that. Next, what does climate finance have to do with people? Hopefully I've made this a bit obvious so far, but let's really hone in. So there's two ways that climate and finance are related, kind of a 360 approach, right? Where finance affects climate change. And the question here related to you as an individual is whether your bank or pension fund is helping or hindering climate action. What are they investing in? Are they cutting emissions from the companies and areas and infrastructure they're investing in? Like, are they investing in renewable energy? Are they investing in climate resilience? Or are they investing in fossil fuels and making those emissions happen? And then the impacts from climate change onto finance. And this is something, maybe harder for us to understand as individuals or think about as individuals, but really important when we look at Canada as a whole. Do you have confidence in the financial system? Do you think it's going to be stable as the climate crisis worsens? As the climate crisis worsens, we should not be sitting here thinking about, how's my portfolio performing? Do I trust that I'll be able to take my money out of the bank to pay my bills? But the reality is that is a risk. And historically, financial underregulation, so when the financial market, your bank can do whatever it wants without guidelines and restrictions from the government, that always hurts people. So if you think about the 2008 financial crash, which I'm sure everyone has either front of mind or locked away back of mind because it was unpleasant, the crisis from those banks collapsing affected everyday people and made kind of us tighten the pocketbook for issues that we didn't cause and the government should have been overseeing. So that's a really great example when we're talking about kind of a climate finance crash and why we should protect against it. You as an individual here have power in so many different senses to affect climate finance and to make it better. You're of course a client of your bank, you're a pensioner, but most importantly, you're a citizen who can direct the government and encourage the government to do more on climate finance policy and overseeing things. I was debating pausing for questions, but it might be smoother if I just kind of go straight ahead. Does that make sense, Gabrielle?
Yeah. I think that sounds good. Yeah, I can keep an eye on questions. Everyone should feel free to put them in there and we'll have plenty of time to get to them at the end.
Super. Okay, so now what does climate finance have to do with policy? We've shown why climate and finance are an issue. It's super related to us as individuals. But what makes sense for action? Should we be talking to our banks, hammering on their door, writing to our pension manager? Or should we maybe be looking to policy? Fixing the whole system through policy means we don't have to race around improving each institution independently. Like that game where you have to hit the gopher wherever it pops up is a lot more work than, fixing the whole system and addressing it all at once. And I can add a bit of a story here. As Gabrielle mentioned, I used to work in sustainable finance and I shifted to working on policy because I had the opportunity to do really great things with the institution I was working with and invest in positive projects for Indigenous reconciliation and an equitable climate transition. But I kind of stepped back and thought, okay, I'm working with a couple $100 million at the institution I was working with. And that was really great. But you zoom out at the whole financial system and you realize it's a drop in the bucket. So how are we going to change every single one of these institutions to move in the right direction? Well, the way you do that is through policy. That's how you change the rules of the game instead of, trying to negotiate with every single group playing it. Rules exist for a reason because, let's be realistic that the goal of a bank, the purpose of the financial system is profit and efficiency, not climate action or sustainability. So a lot of banks and pension funds have been making voluntary commitments to reduce their emissions, but aren't taking the accommodating actions, aren't even really making plans to deliver on those commitments. those commitments, in short, do not lead to action because they have other higher level mandates to continue working like a bank, not bring down emissions. So the rules exist to address that institutions, banks, pension funds won't necessarily go all the way on their own. A lot of them don't even feel comfortable going all the way to climate action without further direction from the government, because they would be, going against what their initial business purpose is to do. And that needs to be fixed. Policy is really the way to do that, to ensure that all banks, pension funds, financial institutions stop investing in problems and start investing in solutions, not just claiming to be. So the required outcome here, what are we really looking for with policy? Saying our financial system should help limit warming below 1.5 degrees. Bankers or investors will say that's pretty vague. How do I help align the world with a 1.5 degree pathway? All of those details. It actually isn't that complex. There's a lot of very specific actions that a bank or pension fund can take. Environmental Defense and Partners wrote a report outlining what this would be, what credible commitment would be for climate action. And it includes things like, cutting emissions in half by 2030, not relying on carbon offsets or carbon disclosures, which have been proven by many leading sources to not result in any emission cuts. So aligning with 1.5, bringing the financial system in line with climate action may seem vague, but we have a lot of very specific details from the leading climate scientists, economists, which are easily distilled down and which we have distilled down. I'm happy to talk about those details if helpful. Now looking at what's happening in Canada, what does climate finance have to do with policy here at home? Canada is way behind schedule. A leading international group called Canada a low regulation jurisdiction, which means we're behind schedule. The federal environmental auditor came out with a report today saying that our federal regulators are way behind other international countries in terms of setting rules for bringing the financial system in line with climate action. So we have a lot of work to do. And if we think about this, Canada has, prided itself on the international stage for being a leader on climate policy and comes forward with many, points of success that the government would like to point to, like carbon pricing, or other areas like an oil and gas emissions cap, which is coming up, electric vehicle mandates. But what about on finance? That's still a very significant gap. So we are a low regulation jurisdiction when it comes to climate and finance. And as we just outlined, we can't leave it to the financial institutions to do it voluntarily. Policy has to come forward in this area, just like Canada's recognized that for every other area of climate policy. Good news, the solutions are very doable. Environmental Defense and Partners, other environmental organizations, EcoJustice and Shift, wrote a roadmap to a sustainable financial system in Canada. We outline, it's a bit of a tome, it's a heavy document because we outline every legal nuance to the policies that need to happen. But in short, this can be done through existing rules. We don't need heavy new legislation. We can work and fix our financial system with rules already on the table. And in this report, we also outline what a real credible climate plan looks like. There's also some signs of leadership within government. Senator Rosa Galvez tabled the Climate Aligned Finance Act last year in March. It's an incredibly comprehensive reform to our financial system to get it in line with climate action too. So, maybe to zoom out, those two, the roadmap and Climate Aligned Financial Act, or CAFA, are both pointing towards the same end of fixing the financial system for climate action. It's just kind of different avenues through parliamentarians like your MP versus through the Senate, respectively. And this is exactly that outline. So CAFA in the Senate, this was endorsed by over 150 organizations and academics. Right now, it's stalled from moving to the next stage. The next stage would be having it studied, debated in the Senate's Banking Committee So we could at least have an honest discussion about the risks from finance to climate and from climate change to our financial system. That really needs to move forward to that discussion and deliberation stage. And then in the House, there's no political action right now to fix this part of climate policy. It's a significant gap. The House is incredibly important. So your members of Parliament should be way more engaged on these issues of climate finance, especially those who are already looking at climate. This is a really big gap. We'll get to what you can do, but demonstrating to your MP that you want rules to ensure our financial system is in line with a safe climate is super important. This is a useful reference. I mentioned the roadmap we wrote. You can use this to look at what a credible climate plan really means, and kind of, drop the whole paper as you're talking to any members of Parliament or members of government who are, saying, I don't know what to do. Interesting issue. I don't know what to do. Here's exactly what they can do. It outlines what needs to happen to shift our banks and pension funds rules to get them in line with the safe climate. So what can you do? I mean, again, thank you so much for your work that you've done to contribute to better climate action in Canada. You as individuals, as citizens of Canada, as parents and grandparents, have so much power to help us build a better Canada, a safer world, one where we're moving on climate and acting on reconciliation in real ways. So tell senators to advance the Climate Aligned Finance Act. Tell your MP, your minister, your member of Parliament to support similar policies. Share this with the ministers responsible for those files. So Minister Freeland of Finance and Minister Guilbeault of Environment and Climate Change. And then also contact your member of Parliament. And I know you all have really active relationships there, or many of you do. So tell them that you want banks and pension funds to help Canada secure a safe climate, that you're worried about financial stability in face of climate change. And you're worried that banks and pension funds today are making climate change worse by investing in polluting activities. Let's fix the system, not have to, hit each gopher of bank and pension fund individually. So I'll conclude by reminding you that, financial policy is climate policy. So I've been talking about finance or climate. It's the same thing. The government has to get going. We're way behind schedule. And fixing the financial system in Canada is one of the most powerful things you can do right now to tackle climate change, because this is the biggest area of a blind spot for our government when it comes to climate policy. Thanks so much. I'm really looking forward to the discussion and your questions.
Thanks so much, Julie. That was a great overview, and we do definitely have some questions that have come through. I wanted to ask those who ask questions, if you want to, you're welcome to sort of speak to your question out loud if you're interested. So maybe I'll call on Caroline first, if you want to share your question again. I'm also happy to if you're not.
Yeah, sure. It's just when you were talking about, I just want to get my facts straight, because I do presentations sometimes or talk to people sometimes, and you were talking about how Canada's emissions are still growing. But on the weekend, I read an article in the Globe and Mail that you're obviously familiar with it, you're smiling, that talked about, yes, our emissions were up from, in 2021, were up from 2020, but 2020 was the pandemic. So in fact, it was expected that they would go up. It's just that they didn't go up as much as they expected. And so in fact, it was 2021 was lower than 2019, and in fact was lower than 2005. So I guess I just wanted to make sure that, if I say emissions are still growing, that I'm right, or if I say that it's now just maybe starting to go down, that I'm right. I just wanted to kind of clarify.
Thank you for clarifying. I was negotiating that myself as I said it, because you're right. It is a bit nuanced as of the latest report that came out last week, about how Canada's emissions trajectory has been progressing. So the top line, you nailed all of it. Emissions rose 1.8% in 2021, which is the most recent data, over 2020. But you're right, they did remain, they did decrease relative to 2019 pre-pandemic and relative to 2005. So this, like that 1.8% increase of 2021 over 2020 is a smaller than expected increase. It certainly shows that government policy on climate is working, but it also shows that we need a ton more of it to really bend the curve in the right direction. So I hope that clears up what is at this point a nuanced top line fact.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, just for confirming that.
Thanks, Julie. Meg, did you want to speak to your question next?
Sure. Thanks, Gabrielle. Thanks, Julie, for a wonderful presentation. My question was about a snippet. I think I just heard it on the radio that the CEO of RBC was asked about this topic specifically. I don't know if it was about climate aligned finance or divesting from oil and gas or fossil fuel industries in general, but he said something to the effect of doing that would just totally destabilize the Canadian economy, and basically. And I thought it was like so super rich because he specifically spelled out the threat to like our national food security, and I think housing security or something, which is just funny because that's what climate change does. But how do you respond to that line of thinking or that argument where people are just like, it's not financially possible to do the things that are outlined in CAFA or through other calls to action from divestment groups?
I would say you gave a couple good answers in your own question. So I would encourage you to feel confident responding to that and leveraging what you said. A couple different points. I mean, that's a very backwards looking view of the economy. The global trajectory is undeniably off of fossil fuels. The war in Ukraine has increased the movement towards renewable energies. All European governments are saying that they're moving faster off of oil, gas, and coal than they intended to before, because this is actually strengthening their push to renewable energy. So the demand is going to decrease. I mean, I'm always quite shocked by how many financial professionals are not quite up to speed on the latest environmental and scientific analyses, and rather just kind of stick with their priors and what they knew in the last decade. The leading scientists and economists under the IEA and IPCC are all saying that global oil demand is going to peak and decline. So this is something actually outside of Canada's choice. Like, the global trajectory is simply off of fossil fuels. And the question at hand isn't whether there's going to be decreased demand for this, but how is Canada going to position itself in that transition to protect workers, communities who have devoted their lives to that industry, to protect the Canadian economy, which historically is very much based on oil-driven energy. How are we going to fix that? How are we going to change that proactively? It means looking to other industries and not kind of digging our head in the sand and holding on tightly to this really out-of-date economy, because that's what creates damages. You can also point to the fact that in the past year, oil profits have been healthy, I guess, been too large relative to what they should be. But in the 10 years before that, fossil fuels underperformed the rest of investments. So, I mean, we could certainly go on about those. There's tons of arguments and, not even arguments, I would say facts for why investing in greener solutions is much healthier for an economy. But those are a couple that you can start with.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Meg. It's a great question. Steffi, you also have some questions about dealing with these kind of arguments that people have that can be difficult to articulate. I guess I don't know if you want to speak to those directly yourself.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much, Julie, for this presentation. It's really great. As someone who doesn't have a background in finance, I find it kind of daunting to talk to fund managers and banking people, because they say things and I don't have the expertise behind it. So something like a financial policy as climate policy is just gold. It's very, very useful. Thank you. My questions are in response to my conversations with these fund managers, I often get the response of, we need to do it here because Canada is run by the rule of law. Some of those other crazy countries don't have that, so we need to do it here. Another one is stranded assets. We can't have stranded assets because stranded assets, I don't know what stranded assets do. I feel like the whole planet is a stranded asset because of what they're doing, but like, how does one respond in banking terms to those arguments? Thank you.
Thank you, Seppi. So I often say this, finance is deliberately opaque. It's like not as hard and complicated and confusing and specialized and like unattainable as the language suggests. So I think one part of it is just going into it with confidence, and I encourage you to do that. But then, of course, there is the technical answers here. So your first question was, forgive me, I have the stranded asset question in mind.
The rule of law.
Rule of law, right?
Yeah.
Okay, this is a big one because everyone in the financial industry likes to say Canada has ethical oil. If we don't produce oil and gas at, a net zero production rate where they're ignoring the emissions from the end product, then it will be bought from authoritarian regimes and governments. 2 points here. Canada has incredibly unethical practices around its oil and gas. You can look at the imperial oil spill going on right now. Canada has enormous tailing ponds, which are toxic waste cesspools filtered out from the production of oil and gas, which are damaging Indigenous communities' drinking and fishing water, which spill into the Athabasca Delta, which is one of the largest sources of fresh water. Canada does not have ethical oil. Cases of violence towards missing, murdered, and Indigenous women increase around resource extraction sites. That's very true for Canada's oil and gas. Canada does not have ethical oil and gas. Canada does not have a rule of law that protects citizens and communities. The other environmental damages from oil and gas are significant. So I think that's a very important point to focus on whenever anyone says Canada has ethical oil. No, we don't. They're paining people across the country. And then the other point is like every country right now, every oil producing nation is saying that they're going to be the last barrel of oil. That's not going to happen for every single country. That's going to blow past the carbon budget, which forgive me for the jargon, but to keep within 1.5 degrees of warming, we can only globally emit so much. We can only pollute so much. And everyone racing for that last barrel of oil means at some point we're going to not be able to burn them. And so investing in that expectation just creates a bubble, which is going to put our assets at no value. And that's the idea of stranded assets. The term stranded assets essentially means that Canadian banks, pension funds, companies will invest in oil and gas projects, and then they'll become obsolete. They'll become useless. The accounting for oil and gas projects is crazy, where you can put on your balance sheet on the positive side of your company, all of these resources kind of on reserve that you're expecting to be able to sell. And so when you can't sell those in the end, that's when the bubble pops and it becomes what's called a stranded asset or something, obsolete, where the quote asset has no more value. So the questions that Seppi asked are incredibly related to each other, right? If Canada is not the last barrel rolling, which we likely won't be, then all of those asset values that our banks, pension funds, companies claimed to be offering are actually really hollow. I see you thinking, Seppi, did that make sense?
Thanks so much.
Seppi, great questions. I think you have another one shortly, but first maybe we'll ask Sarah if she'd like to share.
Sure. Yeah, I was just wondering, it's sort of come to my attention that a lot of environmental leaders are saying, move your money, if you are invested in these big banks or just have money there. But it sounds like what you're saying is that policy changes are more important. Being that all of us have limited time, resources, does it make more sense to, I mean, it's not like I have $1 million in the bank, right? So I'm not making a huge difference as far as what they're getting out of me. Does it make more sense to focus on policy, or like focus our efforts on writing our MPs, changing that sort of thing, or does it still make sense to move our money to credit unions or other more ethical places?
Such a great question. Thank you. I think if you have unlimited energy for this subject, do both.
Okay.
Move to a credit union and engage on policy. If you're human and have to prioritize things, then let's think about this logically. The policy change affects all of the institutions. It's kind of a rising tide lifts all kind of ideology, where you can fix it at the source, right? And change the way that all of these banks are using. And you also raised a great point. I don't know about others on the call, but I also don't have millions of dollars. I don't think my bank pays that much attention to me as a client. I'm not that, I don't have much sway. So if I move from one bank to a still bad, but slightly less bad bank, weighing the effect of that versus getting policy change so that all banks have to consider climate targets, all banks have to stop investing in pollution to a certain extent, that's really powerful. So I would encourage you, if you're prioritizing actions, to really focus on raising the political profile of this issue, because our politicians are accountable to us, specifically in the House members of Parliament. And they are going to do and prioritize what they hear from us is our priority as their constituents. So politicians who are making action on climate change, or even those for climate action, or even those who aren't, very important for them to hear that you as a constituent want them to set policy that sets our financial system in line with a safe climate. I would really encourage you to start there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Great question. Seppi, did you want to speak to Osvi briefly?
No, I've asked 2 questions already. I'll leave.
Okay, we'll come back to it. I think
Thank you.
someone else is asking about Osvi later, so that's great.
I have lots of thoughts on OSFI.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. Someone asked about, are emissions including end-use release of emissions when oil and gas are exported, in terms of the earlier emission question? Like scope 3, is that included in the emissions, Julie?
Is that included in what?
Like we had the discussion about emissions and sort of how they fluctuate.
Oh, got you.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, the end use of fossil fuels, like when oil and gas is burned or consumed, most of the emissions come from there, around 80%. So most of the oil and gas companies in Canada like to talk about net zero oil, and that they're going to invest in these crazy unproven carbon capture projects and make the production of oil less polluting. But of course, the end result, actually using the oil and gas at the pump, heating your house, that's when the pollution really comes to the fore, and they don't want to be held accountable to that. Canada does not count those emissions in our inventory either. So great to be keeping attention to that, because you're clearly tuned in to that being where the heavyweight is, and that's not being counted by most oil and gas companies. They'll certainly try and avoid that.
Thanks for that question, Ruth. Gail, did you want to ask your question? If you're here.
Yes, I put a second question in. I understand that quite recently OSFI just produced a set of regulations, right, regarding net zero and the ESG regulations for the banking, the financial system. Do you have any comments prepared from Environmental Defense on those new initiatives by OSFI? And are they accessible?
We do. We do. I might ask Alex or Felix to just send in chat our short comment response, maybe the Globe and Mail article as well, whichever you think is most helpful, if not both. I will jump really quickly to a question in chat, the most recent one, and then I'll get back to this as my colleagues send it. A question about any opportunities for kind of civil disobedience or kind of using yourself to raise attention to this. I'll draw you to some of the work led by Banking on Our Future and led by Wet'suwet'en and Solidarity groups. And they've been organizing really quite a number of protests against the banks directly, who are most egregious on fossil fuel financing and disregarding Indigenous rights. So I'd point you to those as some options if you're keen to kind of be present physically. And then back to the question on OSFI. So this OSFI is the main federal financial regulator, stands for Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. But again, they oversee like 1,200 pension plans, about 400 banks and insurers, and their rules carry a lot of weight in what happens in Canada for climate policy, or pardon me, for financial policy, and hopefully for climate policy. They set out rules just a couple of weeks ago requiring financial institutions to report on their emissions. We were engaged with OSFI, they had stakeholder comment periods, and so we engaged on that really right from the outset. Alex is sending our comments. We also did a webinar when the draft first came out, explaining kind of our thoughts on all of this. And here are the top lines for those of you that don't want to delve into all of those links. These rules are a first step to get the right information about finance out there, or about climate financed emissions out there, but it doesn't actually change what institutions are investing in. So essentially, it's like the foundation where now companies and financial institutions will have to report on how many emissions they're investing in, what their operations are doing. And that's really important for those of you familiar with emissions scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are included in this reporting requirement. So that's good. A second piece is that OSFI is asking financial institutions to report on their resilience against 1.5 degrees of warming. That's really important too. They previously had it at a higher threshold. And so now they're saying, will your business operate? What are the risks to you if we manage to keep global warming at 1.5 degrees? And that may sound a bit weird, but what that effectively does means that the financial institution will have to say, okay, I'm invested in all of these fossil fuel assets, which don't fit into the carbon budget for 1.5. So are those at risk if we meet our climate targets? And that should give some good information. But again, aside from that, this is essentially a reporting exercise, what's called disclosure. And what we really need is policy for alignment for the financial actors to actually change what they're doing. My top line here is this guideline is making financial institutions count their emissions, but we need to cut them. And this regulation doesn't yet do anything to make financial institutions cut their emissions. That's where efforts need to focus.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Very clear answer.
Thanks for the question. You're on mute, Gabrielle, but I think you're landing up another question.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I was on mute there. Anna, I believe, had her hand up. Anna, are you still with us? And would you like to share your question out loud?
Sure. Thank you. I really appreciate this idea of prioritizing systemic change. And it's definitely, where I want to focus my efforts. So beyond speaking like individually to MPs or senators, can you recommend some organizations that are organizing people in groups? I have been looking at like Citizens Climate Lobby Canada. I think they've been doing some work with senators, and I did see a presentation with Senator Rosa Galvez there. I've been involved with Council of Canadians. They've been focused on like the just transition legislation, but I'd love to bring this up with them. So, but are there other organizations that are organizing groups? Because again, I think groups coming and meeting with MPs and senators is maybe more effective than like the individual contacts, although that's good too.
Awesome. Thanks for the question. I would point to environmental defense. We're starting this up and trying to support some engagement, some letters to folks who have the power to make these changes. So I'll invite Felix, my colleague, to maybe post in chat a link you can sign up to get more educational resources from us, and then also stay tuned for some digital actions you can take in engaging with members of Parliament. And I think you're asking a very good question about kind of group meetings and also individual meetings. I think on this issue, it's so new to a lot of parliamentarians that having both is still very powerful. Hearing the same thing from multiple people and multiple occasions can often be, I don't want to compare, but can often be very powerful in terms of getting someone to move forward on an issue, kind of rather than just hearing it once in a group setting, or maybe even as a lead up to hearing it once in a group setting. So I really appreciate that flag. I think we'll definitely think about how to help facilitate something like that. And in the meantime, would encourage the one-to-one action as a lead up to something bigger. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Hannah. And just to add to Julie, for our kids we have a sign-on senator letter we're sharing at the end of today's session. And we also have a group of parents who have been reaching out to and meeting with senators, and people are very open to doing that as groups and coming together as parents to kind of share their stories and their reasons for pushing for this collectively. So we'd love to have you involved in that. You're more than welcome to reach out, and I'll share information about that at the end as well. I think maybe next we had a question from Meg on pensions writ large. Do you want to go, Meg?
Yeah. You sort of reminded me that so I'm a member of the university pension plan, which it's a newer plan that is a collective of it just started with 3 Ontario universities, but I think it's growing. So I'm wondering what your counsel is about trying to influence the investment decisions of the for those of us who are in like these public sector pensions, if that's a meaningful route, if there's been much success. I will say that my lovely colleagues at the University of Guelph are like deeply uninterested in doing this, but I'm a member too, so I'm willing to go to bat for it.
That's awesome. Super great opportunity to engage with your pension plan. And I would say, I've been talking about banks and pension plans in one sentence, but pension plans are, should be a bit more amenable to engaging with people because, you're the beneficiary, you're the clear client, whereas banks have loads of different business models. But pension plans have a duty to advance the best interests of their beneficiaries. So you, the pension holder. UPP is an interesting one. They have one of the more progressive climate policies, and they also have done beneficiary engagement when they were designing this climate policy. Because they're new, they were able to start with that. So I'm sure you've kind of looked on their website to see beneficiary engagements. I think they probably have AGMs. Engaging in that is awesome. It can also be maybe, I don't know your personality, but maybe a bit scary on your own. So I would also point you to a group called Shift Action for Planet Health and Pension Wealth, because they do exactly this type of work in terms of helping beneficiaries engage with their pension plan.
Okay, thank you.
And if one of my colleagues want to post their website in chat, that would be awesome. That's for Shift.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, and we are in touch with Shift and hoping to do a session with them sometime this year as well, because I think we have a lot of parents or grandparents that this is very pertinent to. So we'll definitely keep that in mind as another area to put pressure on as well. We also had a question from Betty. Do you want to speak, share your question, Betty?
Hi, sure. Yeah, it's just back to the OSFI. I just wondered, did they announce in that report or in that expectation what the deadline is for when these banks have to have reported at least what they're currently doing? And then for the future, did they mention that, going forward, expect to see limits or parameters around cutting emissions?
Great questions. OSFI's regulation comes into play 2024. And for scope 3 emissions, so like that means essentially think about the burning of oil and gas, or for financial institutions, what they're investing in is all scope 3 emissions. That's even a year later. So it's not anytime soon. OSFI has recognized that they're 3 to 4 to 5 years behind other international supervisors. So we're way behind, and that's because we started late, which is all the more reason to push even harder at the kind of political level to make movement happen. And OSFI has been pretty clear that they see their role as protecting against financial stability risks, but also protecting Canadians' confidence in the financial system. They have not shown an indication that they're going to get to that part of cutting emissions. I'll be honest with you, the banks are already like getting their backs up about just having to count them. So the next steps really need to come from the political level of saying, of Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau, of Minister of Finance Freeland, saying the direction our country and economy is going in is climate action. They've already stated that, right? And they have to step forward saying, we are going to make sure the financial system aligns with the direction that Canada's government is trying to go. So that's where that next step of cutting emissions has to come from. Canada has, I'm not sure if Canada has like a plan to reduce emissions from every sector of the economy called the Emissions Reduction Plan. So again, I mentioned, a cap on oil and gas production emissions, targets for EVs, incentives to invest in electricity and build a net zero electricity grid. Finance, there's nothing. The financial sector has to pull its weight and has to be guided by the government to cut its emissions. We haven't seen indication that OSFI will do that yet. And, I'm really looking to our politicians to move forward. And I can also share, just today, as I mentioned, the Federal Environment Commissioner put out a report saying that OSFI is years behind other countries and isn't doing that piece on cutting emissions yet, while some other regulators in the EU and UK are. So I very briefly summarized this in a thread here and won't waste too much time talking about it, but you can check that out for more details about OSFI and their trajectory and how they're doing, what they're doing relative to other similar regulators in different countries.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for all these amazing questions. I don't think we have any more unless has any final questions. Before we wrap up, it is after 1, and we have, I think, Julie for a couple more minutes. I wanted to share that For Our Kids is really excited to have Julie supporting this work and trying to kind of push the Senate towards moving this bill to committee, and also starting to help MPs understand the need for this kind of legislation as soon as possible. So we have a Take Action page that I'm sharing in the chat right now. So we'd love you to sign on to our Senator letter. I know many of you are very engaged organizers and activists and want to do more. So there's the sign-on letter to start, and then there's information about how to reach out to senators and MPs and some guidance around talking points for this issue. So those are some places to start, and you can reach out to me anytime for questions about that. We also, Environmental Defense did share their sign-up page, but they are have great resources, and we'll be following up with people about ways to get involved as well. So I'll share that in the chat. And then I encourage you to sign up for the Banking for Our Kids campaign, because we do run info sessions like this regularly, and are trying to support parents and grandparents across the country to get more knowledge and skills around advocating for these issues. And we think banking and finance is a huge piece of the puzzle to solving the climate crisis. So we really encourage you to stay up to date and get involved. And I think, is there anything else that you would say as a kind of a final note, Julie, around next steps or what to keep in mind as we push on this issue?
Thanks, Gabrielle. Thank you to For Our Kids for all of your work on this issue. Thanks to everyone for your interest, your really excellent questions. This was super. I kind of live and breathe climate finance policy. So if you have questions, please, feel free to stay connected with us through the link my colleague sent. You can keep up on my LinkedIn and Twitter, and feel free to reach out as well as you have questions. But Gabrielle is also building some really excellent resources to help support engagement with your politicians. And I encourage you all to make the best use of those and use your power as great individuals in this country to move forward. And I believe this will be recorded and shared on For Our Kids website.
Definitely, yeah. This has been recorded and it will be shared on our website and in a follow-up email shortly with information again about the work that's happening in environmental defense as well as For Our Kids. So you'll have all those resources in your email by tomorrow. And again, feel free to reach out anytime with questions. Thank you so much, Julie. That was super informative and helpful. Really grateful for you taking the time.